A great pleasure to introduce Victoria Chen today. Victoria received her PhD from the University of Hawaii Manoa in 2017, and since 2018 has been at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, not named after her, I believe, where she is now a senior lecturer. Victoria is a theoretical syntactician and field worker who's worked extensively on aspects of Formosan languages of Taiwan, especially Puyuma, Amis, and Sedic. And she's also thought a lot about the diachronic grammatical change and Austronesian subgrouping, including with a paper that's forthcoming in Diachronica. Victoria has been a consistent presence at AFLAs for just about as long as I could remember. So I checked, and indeed, she's presented at AFLA 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, and now 28, beginning as a graduate student. And every time I meet Victoria, I learn all sorts of new things. I learn about these Formosan languages, about interesting and carefully described aspects of their grammars, as well as new theoretical ways of thinking about the syntax of these languages. And also, I learn new things about Victoria, including that she's always starting new projects and starting new things. So actually this year, she just began a major grant from the New Zealand government on the morphosyntactic typology of Formosan languages. So I'm really happy to see that we can hopefully count on her sharing this work over the next 5 AFLAs consecutively as well. So with that, I'll turn it over. I'm delighted to welcome really one of our own, today presenting the design of Philippine-type syntax with special reference to Formosan.
Thanks, Mitchell, and thank you, AFLA organizers, for having me, and thanks everyone who's here. So today I'll be focusing on 3 common features of Philippine-type languages that have received less attention in the literature. So the first feature is pronominal-clitic climbing, which is very common in Philippine-type languages. This is illustrated in 1. So in both examples, we see the person and number features of the pivot and the non-pivot initiator are copied onto a higher head, such as a negator or an auxiliary head. And this is something that's found both in Formosan and non-Formosan languages. And the second feature is a well-known voice marking constraint on infinitival verbs. So in both Kavalan and Puyuma, for example, when a restructuring type verb selects an embedded verb, the embedded verb must be marked in active voice. But even the pivot marking present on the same argument, we know the real voice marking is on the matrix. So this is another constraint that I will be exploring. The third feature is the one-to-many correspondence between voice and pivot selection. So this is seen in the 4 Pi1 examples in 3. So we can see that with the stem voice marking and then the circumstantial voice morphology, the recipient of the pivot marking can range from adjunct-like phrases such as an instrument or a reason phrase to something that's canonically analyzed as a core argument, such as the theme in productive causatives or a theme in ditransitives. So the questions I will be asking today are, what are the clitic pronouns in 1? And what do the voice constraint and the one-to-many correspondence between voice and pivot selection tell us about the design of Philippine-type voice? So, and I'll be arguing that probably the so-called clitic pronouns can be analyzed as they spell out of the 5 features of topics and subjects. And in this way, we can simply see these 5 features on the auxiliary verb as the spell out of topic agreement and subject agreement that cross-reference the subject and the topic. And under this approach, we can see Philippine-type voice as tracking the agree relations targeting topics and the relative phrases, relativized phrases. And we see this real voice marking that's always present on the highest verbal head within a CP. And the voice marking constraint in 2 can be viewed as instantiating the default agreement on non-highest verbal head. And in this approach, we can view languages with the traits in 1 and 2 as both agreement-based and discourse configurational. And finally, we'll be looking at the one-to-many correspondence between voice and pivot selection reinforces the view that Philippine-type voice might not be hosted within individual verb phrases as valency indicating affixes, but more like clause-level agreement morphology that's associated with the presence of a finite CP layer. So the next question is, how unusual is this design? And we'll be looking at some non-Austronesian data that shows similar patterns. For example, in Western Nilotic and Caucasian, we see similar kind of verbal morphology that indexing the agree relations, probing the goal of some kind of A-bar probe, such as topics, WH phrases, or relativized phrases. And we also see some kind of default agreement on O non-highest verb, similar to the constraint seen in 2. And finally, I'll be discussing an alternative approach to the Philippine-type pivot on the extraction constraint by viewing that constraint as the outcome of different A-bar operations sharing the same set of agreement morphology. Okay, so a quick outline of this presentation. I'll be first doing a quick review of 2 approaches to Philippine-type syntax, and we'll be moving on to a discussion of 3 patterns of voice marking constraint and Formosan, and moving on to a new proposal for Philippine-type voice morphology, and then viewing the design of Philippine-type syntax from a more typological perspective. Okay, so I guess most of you are quite familiar with what a Philippine-type voice system is, so I will be skipping the definition here in 5. But it's noteworthy that this voice system is attested in all Austronesian primary branches except Rukai, which is the single-member primary branch located in Taiwan. In this language, there is no voice distinction in root environment. So given that 8 of the 9 branches that possess this voice system are located in the Austronesian homeland, which is Taiwan, we can assume that Formosan languages provide important evidence for understanding the prototypical design of Philippine-type syntax. And this voice system can also be traced back to Proto-Austronesian, or at least very early history of the Austronesian family. So a brief introduction of how the system works. So this set of examples are very well cited. So, and as we know, in active voice, we see pivot marking present on the external argument. And in patient voice, it's present on the internal argument. And locative phrase, it present some kind of locative phrases. And in circumstantial voice, it can focus on different kinds of adjunct-like phrases, such as instrument or benefactor, or purpose or manner. But note that the straightforward patterning between voice and pivot selection is not that simple when it comes to non-simple clauses, and we'll be looking into this in section 3. And finally, this pivot-only constraint is worthwhile noting. So as we know, in relativization, whatever is relativized must be indicated as the pivot by the voice morphology on the verb inside the RC. So here, the very question for understanding this voice system is what enables various types of internal arguments to extract and receive pivot marking in non-active voice clauses. And there are 2 long-standing approaches. The first approach is to treat voice morphology as some kind of valency rearranging affixes that's hosted within voice P. And these affixes promote different kinds of internal argument to the face age of voice P. And then I will refer to this as the approach A. An alternative approach is to place voice morphology high in the left periphery and treating it as some kind of clause level agreement morphology that tell us about the grammatical role of the topic. And here are some more details about these two approaches. So approach A, which could be generalized as argument structure alternation approach. The baseline assumption is that whatever renders the pivot in non-active voice clauses is the highest internal argument. So that is to say, in these clauses, the pivot is always the second highest DP, right below the external argument. And this entails that in locative and circumstantial voice clauses, the pivot is introduced higher than the theme, which also assumes LV-CV morphology as indicating the presence of an apple head above the IA. And in this view, as mentioned earlier, voice affixes are treated as latency indicating affixes hosted within voice Ps. And there are two variants of approaches under this family of analysis. One other approach is to treat whatever renders the pivot as the topic of the clause. And this phrase is probed by UTOP on a C head and carries topic marking pivot. And importantly, given relativized minimality, a phrase doesn't need to be the highest DP to agree with an A-bar probe such as UTOP. So under this approach, there is no need to postulate argument structure alternation between PV and LV or CV, simply because a locative or instrument topic doesn't need to be the highest IA to agree with UTOP. And this idea is similar to WH extraction in English. So for WH questions like 10A and 10B, we don't have to postulate applicativization of the adjunct or the IO to enable WH extraction. So in this view, voice affixes are some kind of class level agreement morphology that tells us about the grammatical role of the pivot. There are also two variants of approaches under this families of analysis, which I'll be talking more about this later. But to begin with, we'll be first looking at some three voice marking constrained and Formosan infinitives, and to sort of evaluate these two approaches. So there are three kinds of voice marking constraint attested in Philippine-type Formosan languages. And all these constraints are actually observed in the same environment and summarized in 11. So where do these constraints occur? And on any non-highest verbal head per CP, including those in serial verb constructions, adverbial verb constructions, causative controls, or clauses introduced by a restructuring type verb, and also purpose clauses or any combination of the above, such as an SVC modified by an adverbial verb. And in summary, the first constraint is attested in 7 Austronesian primary branches, and the second constraint in 4 branches. And importantly, we see variation within the same primary branch and within the same language and the choice of these constraints. So we'll be starting with the first constraint that's known as AV only. The mechanism here is quite simple. So basically, pivot assignment is always indicated by the voice affix on the highest verbal head. And all the rest of the head must carry AV morphology. And this is seen in 12 and 13. So in Nataya, for the child finished cooking the taros, if the matrix verb is in AV, then the pivot will be will focus on the initiator. But if we change the matrix voice to PV, then the pivot will become the embedded internal argument, the taro. But here, the embedded verb is still need to be in AV morphology, although the pivot placement here indicated that the real verbal and the real voice morphology is patient voice. And we see the same pattern attested in the Puyuma examples 13. So the traditional account to this kind of pattern is to assume AV only as indicating the presence of the deficient voice P, which is then accompanied by voice restructuring and long object movement. So the story is that the AV mark infinitive is structurally deficient and not capable of case licensing the internal argument. So the internal argument has to move up and get keys from the matrix clause. So consequently, the matrix voice controls the case marking of this embedded internal argument. And so there are two implicit assumptions of this approach, which is that the pivot marking that falls on the internal argument and the patient voice example is a nominative or absolutive case from the matrix clause. And the second is that Philippine-type voice is hosted in voice, which is exactly approach A. So the assumption is that because the voice head here is deficient, so that constrains the option of voice marking, which is active voice only. But there are three understudied facts associated with this construction. First is that the matrix voice is actually not restricted to AV and PV. And the second is that the pivot is actually not restricted to the first embedded IA. It could be something even lower. And the third is that this constraint is attested not only in common restructuring environments, but it's something broader. So if we look at the Ataya example 14, we see that actually a restructuring type verb like finish can bear circumstantial voice morphology, and then the pivot marking refers on the benefactor of the embedded clause. And the same kind of voice morphology can focus on an adverb like quickly. And here again, we see the pivot falls on an instrument of the embedded clause, skipping the internal argument. And it can also focus on an abilitative model like be able to. And here we see that the pivot falls on not the first embedded in IA, but the theme of this ditransitive like construction. Circumstantial voice can also mark the first lexical verb of serial verb construction, and with the pivot falls on an instrument. And we also see the same pattern with productive causative, and here the pivot falls on the second embedded theme. Same obtained with object control with circumstantial voice marking force. We can see the pivot present on the second embedded argument. And the same observation is observed with other kind of other AV-only Formosan languages, like in Taiwan. And I will be skipping the example here. So in short, we actually see Philippine-type voice marking in these Formosan languages as always climb to whatever is the highest head, but the property of this head can vary. So this is saying in my example 16. So we have three sentences. I gave the child the tarot. I tried to give the child the tarot. And I secretly tried to give the child the tarot. So wherever you can see, if I ever get real voice marking here as the highest verbal like head, such as the adverb in 16C. So here we see that the traditional voice restructuring approach to this AV-only constraint might not be so useful. And importantly, we see the same kind of phenomenon in the Western melodic language Dinka, which possesses a kind of topic indicating agreement that also climb to the highest verbal head within the CP. So this is seen in 17. So we have three sentences, one with only a lexical verb, and the second with an adverb modifying the lexical verb eat, and the third with a perfective auxiliary. And voice marking here always climb to the highest head. And all the lower verbs carry some kind of non-finite marking labeled as an F, analogous to the AV-only constraint seen in Formosan. So what does this constraint tell us? The first is that placing Philippine-type voice within individual voice keys seems difficult to maintain. For example, if we treat the CV morphology as an applicative affix, as argued by the approach A, then we have to assume adverbs and modals like quickly, again, or be able to can take valency indicating affixes such as applicative. And we also have to assume in a sentence like 18, where pivot marking falls on the second DP within the embedded clause, is a special control construction where the theme is applicativized above the controllee to enable this phrase to get pivot marking. And we also have to assume a similar kind of non-canonical causative construction where the pivot marked theme is applicativized above the causee. And also importantly, this putative applicativization is not seen in binding fact. So this is a CD example showing that even if we have CV morphology on the verb with pivot marking falls on the second embedded IA, we don't see evidence for this IA to be promoted higher than the first IA. This is seen in the binding relation here between the causee and this theme of the caused event. The other thing is to mention is that these CV morphology actually inflect for mood and Philippine-type Formosan languages. So analyzing these as applicative affixes also versus this assumption that applicative morphology in these languages inflect for mood, which is quite unusual. And finally, notice that the locus of this putative applicative marking is unexpected. If we look at, for example, 21. So here we have, I secretly gave the child a taro. So here, if this LV morphology is indeed some kind of valency rearranging affix that allowed the pivot marked child to be applicativized higher than the theme, then we should see the applicative affix to attach to the embedded verb rather than the adverb secretly. So here we see a mismatch between the expected position for the alleged applicative marking and the actual pattern. And alternatively, the solution for these kind of sentences can be much simpler under approach B. So taking this control example as an instance, as in 22, here we have, I have forced Kabi to give Kiwi money. So here we have this control verb bearing CD morphology with pivot marking falls on the theme. If under the approach way A, we have to assume applicativization of this theme to be base generated above both the controllee and the recipient to enable absolute case to be available to this theme. But under the topic analysis of pivot marking, no argument structure alternation is required for an example like 22. And we simply just need to assume the pivot is some kind of topic that's structurally low in the sentence. And CV morphology simply functions to tell us that the topic in this construction is something structurally low. And we'll be looking more into this approach in section 4. Okay, so now let's move on to the second voice constraint attested in Formosan. So the mechanism here is actually quite similar to AV only. The only difference is that instead of AV only, all the non-highest verbal head in these languages need to copy the same voice morphology from the first voice. So we can see some examples here from To. And notice that here we see exactly the same environment where this constraint occur. It can be, this constraint is asserted in restructuring environment, such as that in 23A, and also a wide variety of adverbs, such as probably or really and quickly and indeed, and also finally. So then we also say that a present on some kind of epistemic model such as should. And in normal control constructions, we also see the same kind of voice constraint. So we have want, mark in PV, and this affix can also inflect for mood, but all the rest of the voice morphology must be in plain patient voice and cannot inflect for mood. And just like that observed with the AV-only languages, we see some kind of long-distance pivot marking licensing when a sentence is marked in circumstantial voice. So this is seen in 24. So if we mark a sentence in PV, then pivot marking can focus on the cause of the sentence, such as the wizard make father eat bananas. Here we see pivot marking focus on the father. And if we want to let the pivot marking to focus on something that's lower, then circumstantial voice affixes can be used, and pivot would focus on something like rest. And the bare verb constraint behave quite similarly in terms of its distribution. Namely, is observed in old and non-highest verbal head and Rukai, which is a language that only preserve AV morphology in root clause environment. But here, importantly, is we can see that we see any non-highest verbal head must carry 0 marking in this language, and with AV morphology present on the highest verb. So in conclusion, we can assume that AV-only voice concord and the bare verb strategy are likely to be alternative post-syntactic options that realize some kind of default agreement. And simply because all 3 constraints are found in the same environment. And given this wider distribution, this constraint might not be directly indicating the presence of size restructuring. And what's important here is that true pivot indicating voice morphology is always found on the highest head. So moving on to the proposal of what Philippine-type voice reading marks. So the take-home message from these 3 patterns of voice marking constraints are that voice marking may not change the argument structure of a clause, and instead it might just simply indicate the relative structural height of the pivot in the clause. And we can propose a voice hierarchy based on the data above. That is, the presence of AV morphology must be triggered by a pivot that's structurally higher than those that can trigger PV morphology, than those that can trigger CV morphology. And whatever can trigger LV morphology seems to be unitarily locative phrases. So that can be treated differently. So that is to say, we can generalize based on finding fact attested in Philippine-type languages that AV morphology seems to index topics that are the highest DP within a clause, and PV index topics that are the second highest DP. And CV simply tells us that the topics is something that's neither of the above. It can either be some kind of adjunct-like phrases or a DP that's structurally low. So that is also to say the distribution of AV and PV patterns with abstract subject and object agreements. So the assumption here is that abstract subject agreement is in the grid relation with U phi on C or T, which target the closest DP. Abstract object agreement is in the grid relation with U phi on the matrix voice, which shows 3 important characteristics: that it's unique per clause and it can only target the highest DP below the matrix voice. It cannot probe into PPs, and it's independent from acoustic licensing, which is not unique per clause. So this pattern is seen in the 2 examples from Amharic. So 27A shows that only the higher DP and a ditransitive can trigger object agreement, which is the recipient in this DOC. And B shows that in causatives, only the causee and not the causant, the thing of the cause event, can trigger object agreement. And importantly, we see exactly the same pattern and with patient voice and the Philippine-type languages, that it's only the second highest DP that can trigger this morphology. And this can be seen in the CDIC example 28. So here we have 2 causative sentences, and one with a causee marked pivot and one with the theme marked pivot. And we can see that PV morphology patterns directly with a COZ pivot and CV. Sorry, the clause here is wrong. This should be CV. So to target the theme of the cause event as a pivot, we have to use CV morphology, and PV would result in grammaticality. So the proposal here is that Philippine-type voice might be agreement bundles that tell us about what kind of agree relation is associated with the topic. So when the goal of UTOP, namely a topic, is simultaneously the goal of other probes, the bundles of agree relation is spelled out as voice morphology, and the schema here is seen in 29. So to describe this in a more descriptive way, AV simply tells us that the subject is the topic, and it's the bundle of the agree relation with U5 on T and UTOP on C. And PV simply tells us that the direct object is the topic. And it's a spell out of the bundle of the agree relation with U5 on matrix voice, and that with UTOP on C. And LV morphology simply tells us the locative phrase is the topic, and it's a bundle of the agree relation between a specific kind of preposition, locative selecting preposition, and that with UTOP on C. And CV simply tells us that the topic is none of the above, and it's a spell out of simple topic agreement. And this proposal accounts for basically the distribution of these four voices and Philippine-type languages, especially that patient voice morphology can only be triggered by accusative phrases that's the second highest dB in the class, but that's something that's lower, but they're the same case. So in a more descriptive view, we can think that Philippine-type voice might be better relabeled as subject topic, object topic, locative topic, and circumstantial voice topic constructions. And we can think that this system can be viewed as discourse configurational in the sense of Lee and Thompson, 1980. So the next question is, of course, how rare is this design? And here we'll be looking into some non-Austronesian data and see that this kind of voice morphology, verbal morphology, seems not too unusual. So there are two Western Nilotic languages, Kermuk and Dinka, that employ something quite similar. So here we can see that both languages possess a three-way voice system that indicate the grammatical role of the topic. So there's subject topic, object topic, and oblique topics, and noted indicated by different kind of tonal morphology. And importantly, both languages possess a nominative accusative style case system, and their oblique topic construction can target various types of adjuncts, such as locative, locative benefactor and manner phrases. And both author that reporting on these voice systems maintain that oblique topic construction involved no applicativization of the adjunct-like phrases. And importantly, we see exactly the same set of verbal morphology and constructions that involve other kinds of A-bar operations. So for examples, in the Dinka example 37, we see that in both WH questions and relativizations, we see the same kind of voice morphology present on the verb. This especially mirroring the pivot-only constraint and Philippine-type languages. And we also see some kind of very similar voice morphology in the Caucasian language Abaza. But the interesting fact is that this language possesses an ergative case system. But nevertheless, we see some kind of verbal morphology telling us about the grammatical role of the goal of some kind of A-bar probe. So for example, here we see the same agreement morphology J that tells us that the subject is the relativized phrase, which can target both the S and the O. And we see a different affix, which is Z, that tells us that the relativized phrase is not a subject. And this can include an ergative element or an indirect object or an applied object. And interestingly, we see various types of different agreement affixes that tell us that the relativized phrase is different kind of adjunct-like phrases, including locative, temporal, or manner. So here is a quick summary of voice distinctions in Austronesian, in Western Nilotic, and in Abaza. So we see different divisions of the design of voice system telling us about the grammatical role of the goal of some kind of A-bar probe. So interestingly, similar to Dinka, we also see the same set of A-bar agreement morphology in Abaza's other kind of A-bar constructions. So for example, we see here in Abaza's WH questions, if the WH phrase is the subject, we see the same affix J present on the verb. And when the WH phrase is a noun subject, we see exactly the same affix Z present on the verb. So here I will be proposing an alternative solution to the pivot-only constraint and Philippine-type linkages. So following Bayer's solution, we could simply assume that in some linkages, an A-bar probe could be satisfied by different specific type of A-bar related probes, such as topic or relative rel. And this has been proposed for the similar constraint in Dinka. So by simply assuming that a flat A-bar probe can be satisfied either by a phrase that bear a rel feature or a top feature, we can account for the fact that we get the same set of voice morphology present in both topicalization and relativization. So in this view, pivot only might not be actually an extraction constraint, but just some kind of agreement morphology shared by different kinds of A-bar operations in Philippine-type linkages. And we do see a similar account for linkages like Dinka and Kalega that possesses a similar set of morphology. So a revised schema of Philippine-type voice is that we can postulate there is a flat A-bar probe on C that can be satisfied either by phrases with a top or rel feature. So the next question is whether we get any supporting evidence for this analysis and whether there are any more similar patterns in non-Austronesian languages. So if this proposed schema is on the right track, that means we assume the presence of abstract subject and topic agreement in these languages, and as well as abstract topic object agreement. So, and if those abstract agree relations are present, we might expect to see the spell out of 5 features of the goal that agrees with these probes. And this prediction is borne out if we analyze the pronominal clitics in Philippine-type languages as agreement, phi agreement. So we note that there are 2 common series of pronominal clitics in Philippine-type languages. The first series can be characterized as a topic/pivot series. So this is seen in 1433 and 44. So here in active voice, we see the person and number of features of the pivot topic is copied onto the verb. And in patient voice, we see both the phi feature of the subject and the topic copied onto the verb or a higher head. So conventionally, these affixes are analyzed as clitic pronouns, but there have also been approaches that analyze them as agreement. But just noting that the second set of clitic pronouns are traditionally analyzed as genitive/ergative, but actually this set of affixes can index underscores and accusatives, which means that this series is better analyzed as a subject series. So this is seen in 45 and 46. So here we can see that this so-called genitive series can cross-reference either an initiator or a theme, or even a weather verb like the rain, rain on me. And we see the same kind of distribution for this third person genitive clitics in Cedic that can cross-reference either an initiator or a theme. So this suggests that it's better to analyze the series as probing nominative or say subject phrases. And finally, if we assume a schema like this, we might assume to spell out the 5 features of direct object and the verb. And this is not common in Philippine-type languages, but indeed attested in some languages, such as in Bunun. So in 37, we have a ditransitive sentence, mother gives me money. So here we see the 5 features of the direct object spelled out on the verb as a clitic. This is conventionally analyzed as accusative clitic, but according to available descriptions, it's actually unique per clause. So in double object constructions, only the higher one can trigger this kind of clitic, the verb. So this suggests that this kind of clitic actually behaves more like object agreement rather than simply accusative clitics. So, and one other question is whether it's true that a topic can trigger 5 feature agreement on the verb. And the answer is positive, that this is actually quite common across languages. So here we see evidence from the Romance language with panel, where we see here that a subject topic can trigger 5 agreement on the verb. So here the masculine agreement agrees with the subject. But when the object is the topic, then here we can see that the verb carries feminine agreement with the object. And a similar observation obtained with the mixed-text language reported in Austria of 2018. So we can see either the subject or the object can trigger topic agreement on the verb. And we see exactly the same phenomenon with the Bantu language Kilega. Okay, so one other interesting observation that has some parallel between Philippine-type languages and some non-Austronesian languages with a similar kind of verbal agreement is about the word order patterns. So we note that Philippine-type languages possess 3 patterns of word order variation. So the first type can be generalized as topic final, such as in Malagasy. So here we see whatever voice is used on the verb, the pivot must be present in the sentence final position. And I assume this word order derives from topicalization followed by predicate fronting, resulted in this right edge location of the pivot. We see another type of word order pattern in some other Philippine-type languages, like in Taiwan, which can be characterized as topic in situ. Simply that the topic is always appear in its thematic position. So in Taiwan, for example, the topic can stay in an external argument position, internal argument position, or various type of adjunct positions. And we also have some kind of flexible word order type, such as in Tagalog or Puma, where we have almost flexible word order among nominals, with some differences. Some languages are stricter, and some language shows a pivot second tendency. But importantly, the take-home message here is we do see word order variation within a set of languages that possess the same voice marking constraint and A-bar extraction condition. But interestingly, we see a variation in word order in Abaza that mirrors the word order variation in Austronesian. So here you can see that in this language, WH fronting is not necessary. So a WH phrase like who in 55 can either be fronted to the left edge or be present in its original position, like in 55B. But importantly, in either option, we see the presence of WH agreement on the verb, analogous to voice morphology in Philippine-type languages, which tells us that here the WH phrase is a non-subject. So this tells us that probably move is not a necessary outcome of agreeing with UTOP, just like the optionality seen in agreeing with UWH. And especially since topics in Philippine-type languages mostly carry over to topic marking, from a processing perspective, movement is not necessary. Okay, so a quick conclusion. Disclaimer, the following conclusion draws only from Philippine-type Formosan languages. But since these languages occupy the majority of Austronesian primary branches, we could assume their core syntax represent the prototypical design of Philippine-type voice. And I remain open to whether the same generalization applies to other Philippine-type languages that are lower level Malay-Polynesian languages. So the first point is that Philippine-type voice is distinct from the term voice used in the Indo-European literature. Since in IA-type voice, the term is used to refer to valency indicating morphology hosted in voice Ps. But in Philippine-type languages, this term might be best analyzed as topic/relative indicating morphology hosted in the left periphery. And just like the similar kind of verbal morphology found in other kind of discourse configurational languages like Dinka, Kermuk, or Abaza, Philippine-type voice tracks the grammatical role of the goal of utop/relative. And this design is independent of case alignment, since we have seen similar kind of A-bar agreement morphology in both nominative accusative languages like Nilotic languages and in the ergative language, Abaza. And if we treat the pronominal clitics in Philippine-type languages as the spell out of 5 features of topics and subjects, then we could arrive at the view that Philippine-type languages are not just discourse configurational, but also agreement-based. And a comparison with other languages like Dinka, Kaleka, and Abaza tells us that the pivot-only constraint could be viewed as the same set of A-bar agreement morphology shared between different kinds of A-bar operations. So in this approach, it's no longer an extraction constraint. So given these comparisons, we could think that Philippine-type syntax is cross-linguistically unusual, but not really unique. I guess I'll skip the theoretical implications here as we have reached 45 minutes. So a final thing is that whether or not, so there has been a question that whether we could treat Philippine-type languages as some kind of languages that lack CT split, that all kind of movement can be postulated as a movement triggered by some kind of A probe on C. And I think there are independent reasons for not favoring that analysis. And I'm happy to talk about this at the Q&A if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Please feel free to use the raise hand function or indicate that you have a question in the chat. We have a couple questions. Let's go first to Edith Aldridge. Edith, you can unmute yourself.
Yep. Hi, Victoria. Thank you. That talk was really, really interesting. But let's see. I'm looking at Mitchell. I wish I were looking at the handout. And that's not. I mean, I love looking at you, Mitchell, but that seems to be what I'm seeing. But anyway, so I will pretend that you're a syntactic tree. Anyway, oh, thank you. That helps. Okay. And stay on this page for a minute because your tree for Proto-Austronesian is a little bit baffling to me because that's extremely outdated and has already been debunked. And actually, one of the comments I wanted to make in your from your data, you've got fabulous data. Is one thing I really like about your work, is that minimally you need to acknowledge nuclear Austronesian in here, because in a lot of your examples here, some of your crucial arguments, you've got beautiful evidence for the nuclear Austronesian subgroup. So minimally you have to acknowledge that one. So, and that comes in the form of the C applicative, right? That and so my that's just my comment. Then I have sort of a really, really fundamental question. You've definitely gone further than the other people who have tried to apply some kind of agreement analysis to this pattern in the past. I think you've done a much, much better job of culling together some arguments in favor of it. But I'm still not very convinced, because bear in mind that the agreement-based analysis adds considerable complication to the derivation, in contrast to the more direct, what you call the traditional analysis. So we got to have some really hardcore empirical evidence. And I think your strongest argument today was probably from the high applicative analysis. Now, one thing I definitely thank you for is you're having shown that there's evidence that the thing can be interpreted, the applied argument can be interpreted low. And I think you're right about that, and that's fine. But this is also, so the point here is, and this also ties in the nuclear Austronesian, that it historically, this marker C, which only occurs in the nuclear Austronesian languages, it comes from a verb and a serial verb construction. And so the reason that it occurs so high, that's your crucial argument for the agreement analysis, is the reason that it occurs so high in these biclausal constructions is because it comes from the first verb in a serial verb construction diachronically. And the reason that the object has to be interpreted low is because historically this comes from a cleft construction, where the pronounced object actually is outside of the nominalized clause, which is the relative clause where the applicative occurs. So and then the other thing is that I wasn't quite convinced by your arguments for an agreement approach was I didn't really see anything in the Nilotic languages, other than really cool data, of course, in the Nilotic languages and in the Caucasian languages, that we're arguing for an agreement-based approach. I don't see how either of these languages poses any kind of challenge to the type of analysis that I have published on, for at least for the historical scenario. I mean, they all historically probably have similar origins, but none of this is surprising to me. And then please tell me specifically how your agreement analysis works in the minimalist program. I've never been able to make any sense of it. What are the features that are triggering the agreement? Okay, thanks. I really meant that to be quick. I didn't mean to go on and on like that.
Yeah, so thanks for these questions. I guess I'll just be simple. So the nuclear Austronesian hypothesis posited that there is a distinction between languages like Rukai and To and Puyuma from the rest of the languages. But I think the circumstantial voice affixes is also shown in To and Puyuma. The form is different, but there is no difference in pavis selection or any voice constraint.
Right, but the form, I'm talking about the form, and that's what's important. So that's what's important. That's the innovation. Yeah.
I don't think the form is that important, since the syntactic functions of those forms are identical. And I guess since we have, I guess I need a a voice paradigm to show people about the voice and the mood inflection of those morphemes. But the short answer is that I don't think the formal distinction between Puyuma To from the rest of the languages matter for the voice analysis here. But we can talk about that maybe later. And another question is about what triggers the agreement. So I guess one important thing is that both voice and Philippine-type languages and voice and Nilotic behaves really more like agreement morphology. So for example, I've shown earlier that both type of voice verbal morphology climbs to higher head, right? Like an auxiliary or an adverb. And I think that that's something difficult to account for under a valency indicating approach to voice. And I think the same kind of voice climbing phenomenon is also found in Abaza. So I believe that whatever we want to analyze these kind of verbal morphology, they behave quite similarly. And descriptively, they tell us about the grammatical role of the goal of some kind of A-bar probe. And neither of those authors are like explicitly talk about what the voice affixes really mark. But I guess the best way we could arrive at is to view the voice affixes as some kind of agreement bundling that tell us about the A feature of the goal of an A-bar probe, like namely the grammatical role of this goal. Yeah. And like, I guess the main fact I want to show in this presentation is that this kind of design is at least not unique to Philippine-type languages, but also in at least 2 language families. Yeah, if that is your question.
I want to make sure that we have a chance to move on to
Sure.
At least one other question. There's a question from Kenyon Brannon.
Hi, Kenyon.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. So could you tell me what your theory leads us to expect for multiple questions, or, you know, what sort of extraction restrictions arise with multiple questions in languages that fall under your analysis? And if that's something you've looked at, and whether or not the expectations are, you know, good ones or bad ones.
Do you mean like sentences with more than one WH phrase? Or...
Exactly, yeah.
Ah, interesting. I would, yeah, that's very interesting. I would expect that voice morphology would go with the highest WH word. That's my prediction, but I never test that.
So
yeah, because given,
this was a somewhat pointed question then. So I know Edith has some work where she shows that no superiority effect is observed in multiple WH questions in Tagalog. So if you have an agent and a theme that are both WHE, either can extract, and then whichever extract controls voice morphology.
Is that a normal pseudo-clef construction or something different?
I believe they both look like normal, regular extraction in the language.
Cool. I'll look more into this. Yeah, I've never tested this in the languages I work on. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Okay, thanks.
I think there was perhaps Matthew had a question, or
well, I did, but I lowered my hand because we're out of time. But if I can go ahead, then sure.
Go ahead. We started a couple minutes late.
Oh, okay. I just had a quick question about the first point in your conclusion, the point about the topic morphology being or the voice morphology being high, like being topic more than something in the voice P. I'm just wondering what your stance is about SVO languages like Malay-Indonesian, where the voice morphology is on the verb, and the verb seems to be low in several ways, like it's not just below the topic, but also below auxiliaries and adverbs and so on.
I really don't know. And I assume those languages are not typical Philippine-type languages. And yeah, and I guess we need language-specific diagnostics to understand better the locus of voice in those languages. Yeah, but I do think there's some potential evidence that voice is hosted lower in Indonesian-type languages. Yeah, but I guess I have to be more careful with this statement. Yeah.
Well, you did say Philippine voice, so I think you were careful. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Unfortunately, I think we'll have to end the session there. Let's thank Victoria again for the stimulating talk. I'll note there's some comments from Edith as well, and hopefully the discussion can continue on Slack, or just now we'll feel free to continue the conversation here on Zoom now if you would like as well.